Hi everyone! Our presentation today is going to be on paid for sex workers, and it is brought to you by Brian, Hannah, Christy, Henry, and Kara.
First, we will begin by looking at the at risk groups in the United States as a whole. um, in Prior to 2020, 47,000 arrests were made per year of individuals involved in sex work in the U.S. as a whole. And this is mostly women who begin around the age of 16, while we see that men are mostly beginning around the ages of 14, so a little bit earlier. Um, Cisgender or straight women make up a majority, so 78% of the prostitution workforce, with 19% being transgender women and 3% being males. So while males begin um, or oftentimes are involved in this workforce being paid for sex much sooner, there are a much smaller proportion of individuals actually being involved in sex work. Um, 33% African American, 17% white, 11% Latino, and 8% multiracial individuals make up the majority of the body of individuals who find themselves in being paid for sex. However, that only adds up to, I believe, 69%, excuse me, which suggests that it, which points towards the difficulty gathering data for situations like sex work, because it's so much more difficult to gather data for crimes that are not exactly reported. And we look into the background of these individuals for the United States as a whole. A majority of the women, specifically, who find themselves being involved in paid for sex work, come from poorer families with weak familial structures. This also includes instances such as sexual abuse, homelessness, foster care, poor education, and conflict in school, like with their teachers and their grades. As I previously described, it's extremely difficult to gather data on sex workers, especially regionally and when you get into more specific areas and smaller areas like Hamilton County, for example. However, if we focus on specific instances like specific accounts or specific data and information about a specific area, we are able to infer and estimate more global and more generalizable statistics. And so, for example, in Price Hill, an area in Cincinnati and Hamilton County, there were a series of over 85 sex work complaints in the area in 2018, which is obviously only 2 years ago, and we can infer from this series of information and statistics that while 85 complaints were filed in 2018, it gives you a broader idea and a more generalized idea of how that might affect the greater Cincinnati area. When we look at race and ethnicity of individuals in the Cincinnati area, while it's very difficult to pinpoint specifics, we are able to determine that there were known to be 783 foreign-born persons as victims of either sex trafficking or involved in sex work in this area. In addition, individuals in the Cincinnati area who find themselves being involved in sex work often share the same backgrounds and challenges as those involved in sex work in the broader United States. So, those being poor familial background, um, poor structure within the family, conflict, poor education, and things of that nature. And we also see a hostile and broken home life and struggles with mental illness. So, individuals being subjugated and treated poorly by parents and schools who also may have a comorbid diagnosis of depression or anxiety and things of that nature may result in individuals, as well as specifically in the Cincinnati area, to be involved in sex work.
It is important to acknowledge that individuals who engage in sex work have some unique outcomes that we'll be discussing now.
When talking about health outcomes in the paid for sex worker population, there are many health disparities. One being that this is a key population that is most heavily affected by the HIV epidemic. And this is because of the work that they are in. So that elevates the risk of them contracting HIV and other STBBIs, which are sexually transmitted bloodborne infections. So to kind of put that in perspective, the prevalence among female sex workers, about 11.8% in lower and middle income countries are affected by HIV, as well as this 1.8% in high income countries are heavily affected by the HIV epidemic. So overall, among the general population in high-income countries of paid-for sex workers, HIV is estimated to be about 233 people per a 100,000 population of paid-for sex workers. And you can kind of see how the decrease from 11.8% to 1.8% from lower, middle to high-income countries, this could probably be contributed to the amount of treatment that is available depending on the country that they're in and the economic status. As well as this, paid-for sex workers experience a very large reduction of safety. There is increased violence, less safe sex practices, criminalization, and less healthcare. And all of this is because of the work that they're in. So increased violence comes from people around them, and this is going to be talked about later on, and this is definitely a health disparity because they can be physically injured, sexually assaulted, verbally and emotionally abused. As well as this increase in violence can be attributed to less safe sex practices because the more violence that there is, the less they're able to promote safe sex practices in their work. Criminalization does the same thing, actually. And as well as that, there is less health care for paid-for sex workers, which we will talk about in further slides. The quality of life for paid-for sex workers is something that is extremely vital to talk about because the rates of physical, sexual, and verbal violence are extremely high and continue to be reported globally. This violence sprouts from their clients, individuals posing as clients, police officers, strangers, and exploitative managers or pimps. And all of these people causing violence to the paid-for sex worker population makes it really hard for the paid-for sex worker population to make their work a safe working environment. So if they're experiencing violence from clients, they're not able to negotiate the terms of transaction, like whether they use a condom or not, or specific sexual practices. As well as this, when violence comes from police officers, it is very hard for the paid-for sex worker to control working conditions as well because they are afraid of being criminalized. And so if they are caught with a condom, this could be evidence against them and counted as prostitution to be criminalized for. As well as this, there is very many unhealthy relationships between law enforcement and medical practitioners due to violence, stigmatization. So paid-for sex workers, as we were talking about with the criminalization and their relationship towards police officers, if they are experiencing violence, whatever the source of this is, they feel unsafe calling law enforcement because they don't want to be the ones criminalized themselves. As well as this, they will rarely reach out to medical practitioners for a multitude of reasons. One, the fear of being criminalized, but the biggest one being the fear of stigmatization. And there is a very low sense of stigma-free medical care for the paid-for sex worker population. And the fear also of this is that their work status, so being a paid-for sex worker, they are afraid that this label that they have for their job is going to be disclosed not only to the hospital, but to families, friends, service providers, and this just increases the barriers to healthcare. And this can increase risk of HIV because of the lack of healthcare that they're able to get. And if you kind of look at the image on the right, I wanted to show how much this violence affects the paid-for sex worker population. So this is a poster from 2019 showing the amount of deaths in the US for sex workers. At the time of this poster, there were 35 deaths in the US that they knew of, and by the end of 2019, they had known of 40 for sure. There are many that go unreported though, which is very common, which is sad to say. A huge challenge among the paid for sex worker population is lack of medical care. And this is extremely crucial because this population needs to be receiving regular STBBI testings as well as cervical screenings and other such things as preventative measures for HIV. And this isn't happening because many paid for sex workers are dissuaded from using the medical system. This is due to criminalization, policing, stigma, discrimination, and violence that we've been talking about before. And a lot of this is due to the systematic failure to protect female sex workers from violence over decades, and this leads to a very deeply rooted mistrust of health and service providers. And it also occurs with any other gendered sex worker because of violence, criminalization, policing, and discrimination. There is a huge fear that their job will be disclosed and they will be at risk of more violence and discrimination, and this is something that they would rather protect themselves from than receiving treatment. And this is something that really needs to change. So there's a huge need for large-scale implementations of community empowerment approaches. And these would allow sex workers to have access to birth control, STBBI treatments, and judgment-free healthcare. And you can kind of see on the right a plan for having these community empowerment approaches to medical system usage for sex workers. But the reason many are not followed through with is because of a lack of funding. And this is extremely harmful because then we are not protecting our paid for sex worker population, and they will continue to not receive the treatment that they need and that is extremely necessary. Becoming a paid for sex worker has multiple effects on acute and chronic medical conditions and injuries. And the reason we are explaining this last is because it makes more sense once one understands the effects that becoming a paid for sex worker has on that population. So one of the things that I'd like to point out is that, as we saw before, many paid for sex workers have a history of childhood trauma. And this is very similar to what we explained before because it's really just in the background of paid for sex workers of having this childhood trauma, and as we said before, will lead to a greater risk of mental illness, and which thus leads to a greater risk of unprotected sex, as well as then leading to more risk of developing an STBBI. So childhood trauma, if one has and then becomes a paid for sex worker, they're at a disproportionate risk of having these challenges. And kind of leading into that, if a paid for sex worker has depression before they become a paid for sex worker, this can very much increase the severity of their depression or even contribute to them adopting other mental health issues. And as we saw before, the adoption of mental health issues can lead to, again, unprotected sex. And it can also lead, therefore, to a greater risk of contracting HIV. A statistic that we found was actually that depression is a significant predictor of unprotected anal sex among male sex workers. And this is extremely important to note, as we can tell that through the statistic, depression and other mental illnesses put paid for sex workers in a position where they are at greater risk of having the challenges of finding care, experiencing violence, as well as increased STBBI risk. As well as this, we know from previous slides that if one is unable to receive medical care, they are at risk of developing a substance abuse disorder, which can increase violence towards the paid for sex worker, as well as HIV. So everything kind of leads to this development or a greater risk of HIV or STBBIs. So If someone has a substance abuse disorder before they become a paid-for sex worker, they're at an even greater risk of this violence, as they may not be in control of their bodies when with a client, then leading towards a greater risk of STBBIs. And a statistic that we actually found is that sex workers who inject drugs are at an elevated risk for HIV and STBBIs. And this makes a lot of sense because they are then subject to a dual drug and sexual risk pathway of developing HIV. And so it's very important to note that there are challenges that paid-for sex workers may experience before they become a paid-for sex worker, but it can increase even more once they
become a paid-for sex worker, thus leading to a much greater risk of HIV than before.
Hi everyone, I'm Christy, and I'm going to be discussing the cost of sex work in the United States. One thing that I'm going to ask you to keep in mind while I'm going through this section is that sex workers encompass a very diverse group of individuals. There's everything from high-end, very independent escorts to those who are forced into sexual exploitation, and the cost of those things and the impact of those jobs vary widely, just in the nature of the work is very different. But still, there are a few really cool studies that I'm going to go through that assess the actual cost of sex work to the U.S. And what that means in our society today. So one study by Dank et al. That was published in 2016 aimed to assess the impact of sex work on the U.S. economy. And their major finding was actually that sex work does benefit the economy. It makes a lot of money for different cities. To explore this, they surveyed individuals who are associated with sex work, either for imprisonment or charges or otherwise, in 8 major U.S. cities that are listed here on the slide. They found that the economics, the underground sex economy benefited the cities anywhere from $39.9 million to $290 million, which is a lot. And this was something that was really surprising to me. There was a unique demographic and regional influence on the cities. So as you can imagine, living in Kansas City is a lot different than living in San Diego. And so things like that, inflation rates, different populations definitely impacted the use of sex workers. One of the main reasons for such a drastic economic change due to sex work is because there are a lot of primary and secondary profiteers. So a lot of legal businesses like hotels, airlines, small business fronts, nannies, drivers, etc. actually benefit from sex work in general. Because individuals engaging in sex work will utilize some of these, whether it's the pimps or the prostitutes themselves, will utilize these businesses in order to have a more effective economic exchange. And by funneling that money through the economy, it actually generates more jobs and economic output than if the underground sex economy had not been there. In addition to the money that sex workers and pimps gain from these interactions, other businesses benefit by proxy. So even though sex work has a lot of moral implications and they can benefit the economy in certain ways, and keep in mind that all of these numbers are not taxable. So anything that is generated from this economy would not be something that would be reported as a taxable economic output. So even though sex workers do make a significant amount of money for different city economies in the United States, it's important to acknowledge that the profession is still illegal. And because of that, there are costs associated with the government that we should consider when we're trying to paint a full picture of the role of sex work in the economy today. So one of the major costs is that of incarceration. And incarceration is a much broader issue than what we're going to be discussing related to sex work, but sex workers do make up a significant portion of the prison population. I specifically have on here a breakdown of women's prisons and what crimes individuals are imprisoned for. So sex workers do not necessarily get arrested for a charge of sex work. A lot of times there will be a charge for something associated with sex work, such as loitering or drug usage or solicitation. And all of those things are illegal and can be related to things like public order or drugs. And if you look at this chart, you can see that both public order and drugs make up a significant portion of the population and the crimes that people are charged for. Any crime, any person who is in prison is going to be a cost to the government. The U.S. spends over $80 billion per year on federal and state prisons, as well as local jails, and sex workers make up, again, a significant portion of this. This number of 80 billion doesn't even encompass the social costs of rehabilitation or healthcare or unemployment of former prisoners, which is, again, more of a cost to the government and another monetary value that the U.S. government has to ask for. And a lot of this is because sex work itself is illegal. There have been recent movements to decriminalize sex work, and that could have different impacts on the economy and the cost to the United States. But again, this is something that has a little bit more nuanced moral issues involved in decriminalizing the profession. So besides being a number in economy, sex workers are also individuals. And there are a lot of specific considerations that sex workers have associated with the profession that other people may not. This can include physical tolls, mental tolls, the significant stigma of the profession, and also the cycle of sex work and poverty itself. In a couple studies that I looked at, there were very specific physical tolls associated with the profession, and because sex work is not necessarily an industry that has health insurance associated, this can be kind of problematic for individuals. A lot of people complained of higher than normal levels of back pain, things like STIs, pregnancy, stuff like that are all very physical tolls that can be a result of sex work. Additionally, there can be a lot of mental tolls on individuals who engage in sex work. It's a very intimate profession, and you have to open yourself up to potentially a lot of different individuals in ways that aren't typical. And this can be shown to impact a person's self-image, their own idea of who they are, and also their relationships. It can be difficult to have an intimate relationship with someone else if you are a sex worker, and all of this has a big impact on an individual's well-being. Additionally, sex work is something that we don't view super positively in society, and so the stigma itself, combined with the nature of the work, can impact things like alcohol usage, drug usage, an individual's self-image, and kind of magnify other psychological issues that may be inherent to this profession itself. Another really interesting part that I read about is that sex work, because it is not necessarily a legal industry, comes along with a lack of access to economic and healthcare resources. So when people have these physical, mental issues that are magnified by a stigma, they can't necessarily get the help that they need in ways that someone who is in a legal and well-established profession could. Sex workers are a vulnerable population, and when an individual has engaged in sex work, they can sometimes be caught in this cycle that's perpetuated by a stigma because they have previously engaged in sex work, institutional regulations, and depending on the exact profession, they might not be able to break that cycle. So there is, again, sex work is a very diverse population, and there's a lot of people who can independently make a living, but then there are a lot of people who are in extreme debt to pimps or drug dealers or loans of some kind and engage in this work because they are desperate. And then because they don't have access to healthcare or adequate economic resources, they can't really break out of that, and it puts them in this position that can be a little dangerous and definitely impact their quality of life. So one hallmark study was published by Van Wiesenbeck in 1994, and it assessed the personal cost of sex work to individuals who engage in the profession. This study used a varied sample of female sex workers in the Netherlands, where sex work was legal at the time, and it assessed, again, only females, and asked them basically how they were doing in their profession. The individuals that they sampled were all over the spectrum of sex work, from high-end escorts to those who maybe didn't have any other options when they were deciding to use this as a profession. Essentially, this study that I'm referencing right now has shown that about 25% of sex workers were doing well, 25% reported significant physical and psychological symptoms, and 50% were in the middle of that scale. More recent studies have shown consistency over time, but generally, self-employed and higher-end escorts fare a lot better than those who are forced into sexual exploitation and trafficking, or those with an economically deprived background, as you can probably predict. I think that this study specifically points to the fact that sex work is kind of a very broad term for a lot of different activities. It can be something that individuals can sustain for a portion of time and be something that's very positive in their lives, but it can also be detrimental and actually harm the well-being of individuals. And when we do that, it gives us this whole new definition of costs that are important to consider when we are discussing the legalities and morality issues associated with sex work itself. So, considering the full costs of sex work, there are definitely some recent government and policy changes that have been enacted for the rights of workers, etc. And we will talk about one specific example.
Okay, now we're going to talk about a very recent public policy change in the state of California. So previously in California, police officers were able to use the finding of condoms on someone's person, in their possession, whether that be in purses, backpacks, all that sort of thing, as evidence that they were going to conduct sex work, prostitution, or any of those illegal activities. So, as we've seen, these sex workers need all types of different protections, whether it be for their health or just from other people. So in 2019, the state of California passed a law denoted SB-233. And what SB-233 did was make condoms found in searches inadmissible as evidence to do sex work. So just finding a condom on a person was no longer probable cause to arrest them for prostitution. But what it also did was provide immunity to sex workers who were reporting sexual abuse or domestic violence. So they were no longer be able to be prosecuted for events that occurred during a sexual abuse cycle or domestic violent event. Obviously, there are some expected outcomes and consequences to passing this law. Previously, sex workers actually stopped carrying condoms for fear of arrest by the police. Therefore, they were exposed to higher probabilities of contracting STIs. Hopefully, with the passing of this law, sex workers can now carry condoms in peace. Additionally, passing laws such as this one will hopefully reduce the stigma of sex work and convince the public to accept it as just another form of labor. It also gave sex workers the same rights that were afforded to others, instead of being treated as a different or special group. Opponents on the other side, however, argue that this will cause other crimes to be overlooked, some of which may be even more serious. They also argue that getting away with crimes will be easier, just by simply reporting sexual or domestic abuse. Their main issue being it is now easier to get away with sex work and or prostitution, whether it be legal or illegal.
The profession of sex work deals with lots of moral and ethical implications, and that probably has a lot to do with why it is illegal in our society today. But it provides an excellent opportunity to apply Ignatian values to this social issue.
Perseverance is the value most reflected in the at-risk groups. Majority of paid-for sex workers come from tough backgrounds. Lacking education, financial stability, and coping with mental illness, paid-for sex workers persevere by making a life for themselves in a profession that is illegal in most places. One of the primary values reflected in the health outcomes for paid-for sex workers is respect, or rather lack thereof. Criminalization of paid-for sex workers represents a lack of respect for the individual's means of providing for themselves and possibly their family. Additionally, paid-for sex workers are confronted with a lack of respect from their clients who may refuse to use a condom or abuse them. This lack of respect translates to an increase in physical as well as mental health problems for the workers. Another value reflected in the health outcomes for paid-for sex workers is education. If the value of education was embraced, specifically education on HIV and other sexually transmitted diseases, health disparities that paid-for sex workers currently face could be diminished or eliminated. Embracing the values respect and education could aid in improving the health outcomes for paid-for sex workers. The legal intervention discussed, California Law SB 233, reflects the values of honesty and compassion. By disallowing condoms to be used as evidence against paid-for sex workers, these workers are invited to be honest and forthcoming about abuse they may have encountered in their line of work. Additionally, it reflects compassion as it gives paid for sex workers more equal and protective rights that are also afforded to the general population. Since the value of compassion is reflected in legislation, the hope is that compassion gets extended to paid for sex workers by the general population as well. One of the biggest ethical concerns is in regard to the health of paid for sex workers. As noted above, paid for sex workers burden health disparities related to their sexual health as well as deal with physical and mental health issues. Thus, ethically paid for sex workers should have access to education on sexually transmitted diseases and protective measures, as well as access to these protective measures like condoms. The other major ethical dilemma is the criminalization of paid for sex workers. By criminalizing paid for sex work, a stigma is added to the profession. For many, this line of work is by choice and the demand is high. Thus, legalizing paid for sex work would legitimize this choice of employment as well as provide health and safety benefits that paid for sex workers currently do not have. This challenge fits particularly well with the Ignatian values of helping people for the greater glory of God and being men and women for others. Addressing the ethical concerns and health disparities of paid for sex workers would be an example of helping people for the glory of God. It is an example of putting aside any bias and helping these workers because they are human too and deserve the same respect and opportunities as anyone else. This also relates to the Ignatian value of being men and women for others. By working on educating ourselves and the general population about the truth about paid for sex workers, the stigma surrounding this type of work may be reduced and empathy developed. Reducing the stigma and educating people about paid for sex workers also fits with the Ignatian value of considering the impact on the poor and marginalized. By considering the impact legislation and criminalization has on paid for sex workers, society can better address the needs of this marginalized group and begin to make changes. In conclusion, paid for sex workers are a diverse group of people. It is important to understand their commonalities and differences to properly analyze the legal, moral, and ethical issues the challenge presents. However, it is necessary to distinguish between those that choose the profession and those that are forced into it when making decisions. By recognizing the at-risk groups, health disparities, cost, impact of legislation, and values of the population, society can better address the nuances of the challenge of paid for sex workers. Given the complexities of this challenge, we have some questions for you guys to think about. Should paid for sex workers be legalized? How does sex trafficking impact the sex work industry? Should information regarding paid for sex workers be more readily available? And if the individual engages in paid for sex work out of financial necessity or desperation, are they choosing or being forced into this line of work? Here are our references.